Nobody ever looked at Celeste Monroe's hands. Not really. They looked at her cart. The industrial gray one with the squeaky left wheel she'd been asking maintenance to fix for 7 months. They looked at her uniform, the pale blue that hotel management insisted on calling cloud white in. Their branding materials, even though everyone on housekeeping knew it was the color of a sky that couldn't make up its mind. They looked past her in the elevator, through her in the hallways, around her at the coffee station in the lobby when she refilled her thermos between floors. But nobody ever looked at her hands. If they had, they would have noticed the calluses on her right index finger and thumb, not wringing out mop heads or hauling laundry bags, but from holding a pen, a specific pen, a cheap ballpoint from the dollar store on 63rd Street that she bought in packs of 12 because she went through them faster than most people went, through excuses. Those calluses were built in the language section of the Harold Washington Library on State Street, where Celeste Monroe spent 4 nights a week and every Sunday morning for the last 9 years, hunched over borrowed textbooks and self-printed vocabulary sheets, building something enormous in absolute silence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The morning of October 14th started the way most mornings at the Aldrich Grand Hotel started, with the kind of controlled chaos that only looks like order from the outside. The Aldrich was a 42-story monument to money in the heart of Chicago's downtown. Loop, the kind of building where the flowers in the lobby got replaced every 48 hours whether they needed it or not, and where the marble floors were mopped so precisely that the cleaning crew worked in overlapping arcs, the way painters work a canvas. Celeste had worked here for 11 years. She knew every carpet pattern on every floor, every guest who requested extra towels, every air vent that rattled after 2 a.m. She knew which elevator was slowest on weekday mornings and which one the kitchen staff used to sneak cigarette breaks to the roof. She knew this building the way you only know something when you've been asked to make it beautiful for other people, day after day, without ever being asked what you think of it yourself. She was on the 14th floor by 7:15, her cart loaded, her earbuds in, one out, the way she always worked. The earbud that was in was playing a Mandarin news podcast at 1.4x speed. The one that was out was listening for the sound of occupied rooms. Room 1401, do not disturb. Skip. Room 1402, cart outside, early checkout. Enter, strip the bed, reset. She moved through her floor with the precision of someone who had stopped needing to think about the logistics and started using that freed-up mental space for other things, like the podcast, like the phrase she'd been turning over in her mind since Tuesday, a legal term that kept appearing in the contract law episodes she'd been working through. Gongsi Jili, corporate governance. The way the phrase implied not just structure but accountability, a mutual weight carried by all parties. She liked that. The idea of weight being shared instead of assigned. Most people, if they'd seen her earbuds, would have assumed she was listening to music, R&B, maybe, or a true crime podcast. People made a lot of assumptions about Celeste Monroe, about what she was doing with her free time, what she thought about, what she wanted. She'd spent 11 years watching those assumptions land and slide off her like rain off a window, leaving no trace except the faint chill of knowing how thoroughly she had been categorized. She was 34 years old. She had grown up on the south side of Chicago in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner, raised by her grandmother Odessa after her mother left for somewhere warmer and never quite found her way back. Odessa Monroe had been a building services worker, which meant she spent her days cleaning the offices of people who did not look at her, in buildings that did not know her name, for companies whose logos she could have told you the history of if anyone had asked. Nobody asked. But Odessa had a philosophy about this, and she shared it with Celeste at the dinner table every night. In the specific, unhurried way she shared everything, like there was no rush because the truth wasn't going anywhere. What's in your head is yours. That's it. That's the whole thing. The job isn't yours. The building isn't yours. The neighborhood might not be yours for long, depending on who buys it next. But what you actually know, nobody can walk in and take that. She'd started with French. Not formally, just her grandmother's kitchen Creole, the Haitian French that Odessa had brought up from her own childhood and pressed into Celeste's ear like a gift wrapped in something that looked like ordinary conversation. It was only after Odessa died that Celeste understood how deliberate it had all been, how Odessa had known exactly what she was building, and had been building it every night, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner, without any fanfare. The library card in Odessa's wallet was still active. Celeste had taken it and kept it. She'd been to the Harold Washington Library so many times in the years since that the security guards knew her by her first name and her usual table. She'd worked through textbooks, audio courses, borrowed DVDs of foreign films that she watched first with subtitles and then without. She'd found podcasts and online forums and communities of language learners who met virtually on Saturday mornings and spent an hour drilling each other in whatever they were working on. She'd learned to be specific about what she was building. Not just conversational, she hated that word, the way it implied a ceiling. She wanted to know how a language thought. Its idioms, its inherited assumptions, the way it structured time and relationship and obligation. She wanted to be able to sit inside a language the way you sit inside a house, knowing where the light came from, knowing where the drafts were, knowing which rooms people only used when they had something important to say. She was, by any honest accounting, extraordinarily good at this. She was also, by the accounting of every institution she'd moved through, a hotel housekeeper on floors 12 through 15. By 9:30, she was in the service corridor behind the Aldrich Grand Ballroom on the second floor, restocking her cart from the supply closet. The ballroom doors were propped open for an audio-visual crew setting up for the afternoon's main event, a high-stakes acquisition meeting that the entire hotel management team had been preparing for since last week. The kind of meeting where the flower budget tripled and the housekeeping supervisor reminded everyone twice to smile in the hallways even when off duty. $1 billion. That was the number circulating through the hotel staff like electricity through a wire, buzzing at every stop, lighting up every conversation. A Chinese investment group was acquiring a majority stake in the Aldrich parent company, Whitmore Hospitality Group. 3 years of preliminary negotiations had led to this single afternoon. 14 people around a mahogany table, signatures, handshakes, and a deal that would reshape the ownership of 7 luxury hotels across the country. Celeste had overheard the number in the break room. She'd filed it away the way she filed most things, with interest but without any expectation that it had anything to do with her. She was wrong about that. Through the propped ballroom door, voices carried, not loudly but clearly enough. A preliminary walkthrough was underway. The lead delegate, a man named Wei Jianming, who controlled the investment group's acquisitions across North America, was moving through the space with his team while a hotel-assigned interpreter translated back and forth between them and the Whitmore advance team. Celeste's hands stopped moving, not because she meant to listen, because what she heard made her body go still the way bodies go still when the mind suddenly needs all available resources. Wei Jianming was speaking in rapid, clipped Mandarin, his tone carrying the particular edge of a man who has asked a question before and received an unsatisfying answer. He was addressing the governance clause in the acquisition contract, specifically, who retained operational decision-making power after the transfer. His words were exact, pointed, legally specific. He was not asking a general question. He was raising a structural objection. The interpreter translated. What came out of the interpreter's mouth was something closer to. The delegation would like to revisit the timeline for the transition period when convenient. Celeste's jaw tightened. That was not what Wei Jianming said. What he said was, the language in Section 7 suggests full operational transfer to the acquiring party within 60 days, which directly contradicts the board oversight arrangement our legal team negotiated in March. We need to understand which version of this contract is being treated as binding. Those were not the same statement. They weren't even in the same zip code. She stood in the service corridor with a stack of pillowcases in her arms, mouthing the correct translation under her breath, word for word, to no one. Feeling the words land in her chest with the weight of something important being quietly dropped, she picked up her cart and walked away. What else was she supposed to do? Nobody had asked. Nobody had looked. And there were rooms still waiting on 13 and 15. The break room on the 3rd floor smelled like burnt coffee and someone's reheated jerk chicken, and Celeste Monroe loved it for exactly that reason. It was the one room in the entire hotel where nobody was pretending anything was better than it was. She ate her lunch, rice, black-eyed peas, and a piece of her Aunt Ruth Ann's cornbread wrapped in foil, and listened to her podcast with both earbuds in, the way she only allowed herself to do when she had 30 uninterrupted minutes and no one needed anything. The episode was on international arbitration clauses. Dense, dry, and exactly what she'd been wanting to get to for 3 weeks. On the table in front of her, her notebook. It was a composition book, the old-fashioned black and white kind, and it had been replaced 7 times over the years. But the contents had always been copied forward, page by page, into the new one before the old one was recycled. Her grandmother Odessa, who had raised her, used to say that some things you don't leave behind. You carry them into the next season. The notebook was 4 languages thick, Mandarin Chinese, which she'd started at 23 after spending 6 months watching Chinese tourists struggle to communicate at the hotel's front desk, something catching in her chest every time she saw the quiet frustration on their faces. She'd thought, I want to understand what they're trying to say. 3 years later, she could not only understand it, she could think in it. French, which she'd started even earlier, at 19, the year her grandmother Odessa passed away and left her a library card and a worn copy of a Haitian Creole phrasebook, filled with margin notes and a handwriting. Celeste still couldn't read without her eyes going blurry. Portuguese, which came from Marcus in the laundry department, who played Brazilian music on his phone every shift and answered every question Celeste asked about the lyrics with enormous patience and zero condescension. She'd reached conversational fluency in 14 months. Marcus still didn't entirely believe it. And Arabic, which she was still working on, the newest and the hardest, stubborn and gorgeous, resistant to shortcuts. She had 3 notebooks devoted just to Arabic and considered them an ongoing argument she intended to win. 4 languages. 0 credentials anyone here would recognize. 1 library card she kept in her wallet even though Odessa had been gone for 8 years, because some things you don't leave behind. Nobody at the Aldrich knew this notebook existed. The few times she'd had it out in the break room, people glanced at it the way people glance at things they have no frame for, quickly, without attaching meaning. A maid with a notebook was invisible in the same way a maid with earbuds was invisible. The costume made everything else disappear, which was, in some ways, its own kind of power. You could build a great deal in the space of being overlooked. She was still eating when her phone lit up with a text from Marcus. They yanked the conference interpreter badge. Don't know why. Management is running around like something's on fire. She refilled twice, put her phone face down, went back to her cornbread. That had nothing to do with her. What happened next, she would later describe, when asked, as something she hadn't planned and hadn't decided. It simply occurred, the way things occur when you've spent 9 years building reflexes in the direction of truth. She found out the situation had everything to do with her at 1:10 p.m. while she was polishing the brass fixtures on the lobby's east wall, a task that put her approximately 15 feet from a seating cluster where a young member of the Chinese delegation was having a tense, quiet phone call. In Mandarin, Celeste Cloth moved in slow circles while her mind moved faster. The young man, she would later learn his name was David Chen, the delegation's junior director of international affairs, was telling whoever was on the other end of the call that the morning walkthrough had been a disaster, that the interpreter had been softening and restructuring Wei Jianming's words so completely that the Whitmore team had no idea. Their lead investor was raising binding legal objections, that Wei was losing patience, that he had told his team privately, before the afternoon meeting, that if the interpretation problem persisted, he was walking, not as a negotiating tactic, as a conclusion. He already doesn't trust this room, David Chen said. He hasn't trusted it since the first call in August, when the translation made him sound like he was asking for reassurance instead of structural guarantees. Celeste kept her cloth moving. Then David Chen's colleague, a man who'd stepped out of the elevator behind him, tapped his shoulder and asked a simple question in Mandarin. Where are the restrooms? It came out of Celeste before anything. Instinct, habit, the automatic function of a brain that had spent 9 years treating language as reflex. She turned, cloth still in hand, and answered in clean, precise Mandarin. Down this corridor, past the concierge desk, second door on your left. There's also one near the coat check if that's more convenient. The colleague blinked, looked at her uniform, looked back at her face. David Chen lowered his phone from his ear. For 3 full seconds, nobody said anything. Then David Chen said, very quietly, in Mandarin, as if he wasn't sure the words were going to come out right. You speak Chinese. Not a question. More like a person gently testing the ground before putting their weight on it. I do, Celeste said. And then, because she was not the kind of woman who performed, she turned back to her brass fixtures and resumed polishing. She heard David Chen say one more thing before she moved out of earshot. He was back on the phone. Different call this time. Voice low, fast, purposeful. She kept walking. At 1:23 p.m., in a way that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with 9 years of invisible work, the afternoon tilted in a direction nobody in that building had predicted, except maybe Celeste Monroe, who had been quietly, stubbornly, ferociously building towards something she couldn't have named but somehow always knew was coming. She was refilling her cart on 14 when Josephine Watts found her. Joe Watts had worked at the Aldrich for 26 years. Started as a breakfast server, moved to banquet coordination, and had been the hotel's senior guest services manager for the last 8. She was 61 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, wore her silver hair in a close-cut natural, and was the only person in the entire tour building who had ever learned the names of everyone on the housekeeping staff without being asked to. She found Celeste in the supply corridor, and she didn't waste a single word. "I know about your languages," Joe said. Celeste looked at her. "Who told you?" "Marcus." "And the guest in 1406 who asked the front desk to personally thank the housekeeper who left him a note in French." Joe's eyes were direct, unhurried. "How good is your Mandarin?" Celeste thought about the interpretation disaster she'd witnessed that morning. She thought about David Chen's phone call. She thought about the phrase, "Gong si jili," and the weight of shared accountability. "Better than whoever they had in that ballroom this morning," she said. Joe nodded once. Like that was exactly what she needed to hear and also exactly what she already knew. The afternoon meeting starts at 2. The interpreter they had is gone. Management is in full crisis. The lead investor is. Joe paused, chose her words. "He came here ready to be treated like someone whose concerns matter. He has not yet received that experience." Celeste's hand rested on her cart handle. The metal was cold. "Miss Holt already told me to stay away from the VIP floors," she said. The words landed flatly, carrying the full weight of what had happened 40 minutes earlier. Diana Holt was the hotel's director of guest experience, a woman who'd held the position for 4 years and ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that the most important variable in luxury hospitality was the careful management of which human beings were visible to which other human beings. She'd made her position on Celeste Monroe very clear, in the lobby, in front of an audience, in the kind of quiet that is designed to cut rather than shout. "You clean rooms. That is what you do. That is all you do. You are not qualified to speak to anyone in this hotel above the 4th floor, and you are certainly not qualified to open your mouth in front of people who are worth more than you will ever make in your lifetime." Celeste had stood still for 3 full seconds after that, said, "Yes, ma'am," gone to the service elevator, let the doors close, stood inside the metal box alone until the shaking in her hands stopped, opened her notebook, written 3 words on the first blank page she could find. "Maybe she's right." Then she'd gone back to work, because the deal was still falling apart, and she still knew why, and that knowledge had no interest in respecting Diana Holt's instructions. "I know what Diana said," Joe told her. "That's why I'm not asking Diana. I'm asking you." She paused. "But there's a man on the 3rd floor named Gerald Ashford who is the Whitmore Group's senior operations director, and he has the authority to make decisions Diana Holt doesn't get a vote on. He needs to know what you know, all of it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, her cart waited, patient and familiar. She thought about her grandmother Odessa, who cleaned offices in the Loop for 31 years and never complained once, but who also pressed this into Celeste every night at the dinner table, in the kitchen while braiding hair, in the dark of a 1-bedroom apartment where 2 people built a whole world out of borrowed library books and an unshakable belief that words were armor. "The one thing they can never take from you is what you know, so you keep learning. You hear me? You never stop." She heard her. She always heard her. "What floor?" Celeste said. Joe smiled, "The slow, wide kind that you only earn. 3rd floor. Take the service stairs. I'm walking with you." Gerald Ashford was the kind of man who'd been in enough rooms to know when a room was lying to him. He was 54, built like someone who'd played linebacker in college and never quite stopped carrying the posture, and he'd spent 30 years in hospitality operations watching the difference between what looked good on paper and what actually kept buildings running. Right now, 15 minutes before the most important meeting of his career, his office felt like it was lying to him. His notes didn't match the interpretation summaries. The tone was wrong. The specificity Wei Jianming's team had signaled throughout the pre-meeting communications wasn't showing up in the translated exchanges. Like, someone had been systematically sanding the edges off every sharp concern, presenting the Whitmore team with a smooth, easy version of a conversation that was apparently anything but. He was reaching for his phone when his door opened. His assistant Priya leaned in. "2 people from housekeeping say they have critical information about the deal. One of them is Joe Watts." Gerald set his phone down. "Send them in." The woman who walked in was wearing a pale blue uniform. She had a pen tucked behind her ear and something in her expression that he recognized immediately as the look of a person who has decided to say the thing they know they should say, even though every available signal in the environment is telling them not to. He'd seen that look on maybe 6 people in his life. He respected it every single time. "Mr. Ashford," she said. My name is Celeste Monroe. I work housekeeping on floors 12 through 15. I need to tell you something about the meeting this afternoon, and I need about 4 minutes. Gerald gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Miss Monroe, talk. She didn't sit. She stood, and she talked. She laid out what she'd observed in the ballroom corridor that morning. The specific clause Wei Jinming had been raising, the governance language, the structural objection about Section 7C, and the March Board oversight arrangement. She described the interpretation she'd heard, and the interpretation that should have been delivered. She explained the consequence, that the Chinese delegation believed they were being asked to surrender operational control entirely, while the Whitmore team believed they were offering a collaborative partnership. Two parties, one table, two completely different contracts in their heads. She was precise, she was organized. She spoke the way people speak when they've been thinking about something for 6 hours and have finally been given 60 seconds to say it out loud. Gerald listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned his laptop around and pointed to a paragraph on the screen, the Mandarin text of the acquisition term sheet, which he'd been staring at with a translation app, giving him garbled output for the last 20 minutes. What does this say? Exactly. Celeste leaned forward and read it, translated it in real time, fluidly, every term placed correctly. Collaborative oversight, rendered as Shi Tongjiandu. Shared decision-making authority, as Gongxiang Jueqi Quanli. The legal register was right. The tone was right. The meaning was unambiguous. Gerald sat back. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you spoken Mandarin?" 9 years. Where did you study? Harold Washington Library on State Street, and every public library branch that had the right section. The corner of Gerald's mouth moved. Just barely. I need to tell you something, Miss Monroe, because you deserve to hear it before I ask you what I'm about to ask you. He folded his hands on his desk. The failure here isn't yours. It was never yours. It belongs to a system that looked at your uniform and stopped looking. That's a system's failure. And if we get through today, I intend to say that out loud in front of people who need to hear it. Celeste held his gaze and said nothing. And in that silence, she held the fullness of 11 years of walking past people who didn't look. What I'm about to ask you, Gerald said, is significant. If I bring you into that boardroom in the next 15 minutes in front of my executive team, in front of the Whitmore ownership group, in front of Wei Jianming and his delegation, and the translation fails, or the interpretation introduces an error that collapses this agreement, you'll carry that. A $1 billion failure. Do you understand what I'm asking? The office was quiet. Somewhere outside, the distant thud of an elevator. Celeste thought about page 34 of her composition notebook. The page where she'd folded and kept the rejection letter from this hotel's guest services department from 14 months ago. This position requires a background in professional communications. She'd read it in 30 seconds and known everything she needed to know about what kind of building she was working in. She'd kept it anyway, not because it hurt, because it reminded her what she was building against. I understand, she said. That's not what I asked. I know. She met his eyes. Yes, I'll carry it. Gerald Ashford stood up from his desk. Good, because if you'd hesitated, I'd have had to wonder whether you trusted yourself. And if you didn't trust yourself, I couldn't afford to. He came around the desk and walked toward the door, pausing just briefly beside her. I'm walking in first. You come in directly after me. When Diana Holt reacts, and she will, let me handle it. Your only job for the next 4 minutes is to stand still and look like you've been in rooms like this your entire life. Celeste Monroe straightened her collar. I've been in rooms like this my entire life, she said. I just never got to face the table before. The service stairs to the second-floor boardroom corridor were gray concrete. No marble, no brass sconces, no carpet. The bones of the building. Gerald walked them quickly. Celeste kept pace. My mother cleaned rooms, he said, without preamble. Not here. A Radisson in Pittsburgh. 19 years, same building, same floors. She knew every guest on site by the second day of their stay. She knew which ones were there for business and which ones were running from something. She knew more about the people in those rooms than anyone on staff, and she was never once asked. Celeste walked beside him, her shoes making their particular sound on the concrete. My grandmother said the people who clean the room always know the room best, she said, because the room tells you the truth when no one's watching. Gerald didn't respond. They reached the corridor, the brass sconces throwing gold light, the frosted glass of the boardroom doors ahead of them with its shadows moving on the other side. He put his hand on the door handle and looked at her one more time. Ready? She nodded. The boardroom of the Aldrich Grand Hotel was designed to communicate one thing above all else: you are in the right place. The mahogany table was 40 feet long. The leather chairs were custom. The windows ran floor to ceiling and gave the room a view of the Chicago skyline that on a clear October afternoon looked like something out of an architectural argument about what human ambition was capable of. Crystal water glasses, not one of them touched, caught the light in the room like dropped chandeliers. At one end of the table, the Whitmore executive team, pressed and tense. Diana Holt sat near the center, posture rigid, chin slightly elevated. Beside her, the Whitmore CFO and two attorneys. At the far corner, separate from the group like a man who was watching a test rather than taking one, Philip Okafor from the ownership group. He hadn't spoken all day. He'd been writing in his notebook since before the room was full. At the other end, 6 men in tailored suits, the Chinese delegation, arranged around Wei Jinming the way planets arrange around a sun. Wei Jinming himself was 60, compact, with the kind of stillness that only comes from a lifetime of watching what rooms do with silence. His arms were folded, his jaw was set. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment to announce it. Later, his junior director David Chen would confirm what everyone in the room could feel, but nobody could prove. Wei Jianming had told his team before the meeting that if the interpretation problem was not immediately and visibly corrected, he was leaving. Not in an hour. In 15 minutes he had flights to rebook. He was done. The boardroom doors opened. Gerald Ashford walked in. Celeste Monroe walked in behind him. The room's temperature changed in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Diana Holt was on her feet before the door finished swinging. Gerald. Her voice was controlled. The kind of controlled that is one thin layer over. Something that isn't. What is this? She is Vanessa. He didn't look at her. His voice carried the particular flatness of a senior person who is choosing efficiency over argument. Sit down or step outside. Those are the options. The room held its breath. Diana Holt sat down. Her hands found the armrests. Gerald moved to his chair. Celeste stood at the end of the table, not quite seated, not quite presenting, just present, still. She could feel every eye in the room, and she had decided, somewhere on the third-floor staircase coming up, that she was not going to let eyes move her. Wei Jianming spoke. His voice filled the room, not loudly but completely. He spoke for nearly 2 minutes uninterrupted, and what he said was a complete accounting. Every instance of distorted translation, every concern that had been softened into a pleasantry, every structural objection that had been reframed as a scheduling preference. He cited section numbers. He named dates. He was not emotional. He was thorough in the way that a person is thorough when they have been dismissed enough times that they've learned to arrive with receipts. He ended with 5 words that fell like a door closing. Woman Buhui Chan Shu De. We will not be signing. He reached for his briefcase. Celeste stepped forward. She didn't ask permission. She didn't clear her throat or introduce herself or wait for someone to give her the floor. She just spoke, in Mandarin, directly to Wei Jianming. The way you speak to a person when you are the only other person in the room who speaks their language and you have something true to say. She started by repeating his concerns back to him. Not a summary, not a paraphrase. His exact words in his exact register, every section number he'd cited, every term he'd used. She wanted him to hear, beyond any possible doubt, that she had understood him. Not the softened version, not the convenient version. Him. Wei Jianming's hand paused on the briefcase clasp. Then she explained the discrepancy. She walked him through section 7 se, in both versions the English term, collaborative oversight, and the interpreted rendering his team had been receiving, which carried the meaning of complete operational transfer. She explained that the Whitmore team had not been negotiating in bad faith. They genuinely believed they were offering partnership. The interpreter had introduced a structural error months ago, and it had compounded in every subsequent exchange until the two sides were sitting across from each other having fundamentally different conversations about the same document. She told him, "You were not being deceived, you were being mistranslated. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction matters." The room forgot to breathe. Wei Jianming looked at her, not at her uniform, not at the spray bottle still clipped to her apron, at her eyes. With the specific, focused attention of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when a room is finally telling him the truth, he unfolded his arms. He closed the briefcase. He sat back down. Diana Holt, white as the hotel stationery, stared at the table. Philip Okafor, at the far corner, had stopped writing and started watching. David Chen, at the far end of the Chinese delegation, pressed his lips together and looked down at the table. Not in shame, but in the way a person looks when something they believed was going to happen finally does. Gerald Ashford stood perfectly still, and if you were watching closely, which Philip Okafor was, you could see in his eyes something that had no business being in a business meeting but was there anyway. Pride, enormous, barely contained. Wei Jinming spoke again. This time his voice had changed, the combative edge was gone. What replaced it was something rarer, genuine curiosity. He asked Celeste, in Mandarin where she had learned to speak this way. "A public library," she said, "and a woman who cleaned offices for 30 years. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that is itself a kind of answer. Then Wei Jianming said one word, in English, for the first time since the meeting had begun. Continue. 47 minutes. That was how long it took Celeste Monroe to do what a team of executives and a professional interpreter had been failing to accomplish for 3 days. 47 minutes to bring two sides of a billion-dollar acquisition to the same table, not the same room, which they'd been sharing all day, but the same table, the same version of the deal, the same language, the same meaning, the same intent understood by everyone present. She didn't just translate. That word was too small for what she did. When the Whitmore CFO used a phrase that read, in direct translation, as aggressive and presumptuous in Chinese business culture, Celeste adjusted the register without changing the substance, kept the point, removed the edge, preserved the meaning while respecting the context. When Wei Jianming quoted a classical proverb to explain his philosophy on business partnerships, "Shanzhanje chu shushi buzarin," she didn't stumble through a literal rendering that would have landed like a riddle. She found the English equivalent in idiom and spirit so that both sides could feel what he meant, not just hear what he said. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when the Whitmore CFO leaned forward and said something that had the potential to reopen the entire governance question in a way that would have taken an hour to walk back. Celeste paused. She looked at the CFO briefly, not accusingly, not dramatically, just a look that said, "I'm about to help you." And then she rendered his meaning in a frame that landed with Wei Jianming the way it was meant to land rather than the way it was said. Nobody in the room noticed except Philip Okafor, who had been watching her with the focused, professional attention of a man who has spent 30 years finding exceptional people in unexpected places. She was, as Gerald Ashford would later describe it in his formal report to the Whitmore Ownership Group, functioning not as a translator but as a cultural architect, building the same structure in two languages simultaneously so that both sides were standing on solid ground. Philip Okafor had stopped taking notes in his personal notebook and started using the official meeting record. Water glasses were picked up. For the first time all afternoon, people reached for them, a small thing. But in a room where no one had felt comfortable enough to relax their hands for 3 hours, it was everything. The temperature in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning and everything to do with the specific human relief of feeling genuinely understood. Near the end, Wei Jinming raised one hand. The room went quiet. He asked to speak privately with Gerald Ashford. Gave no further explanation. The delegation stood. The Whitmore executives stood. Chairs scraped. People filtered out of the boardroom with varying degrees of controlled urgency. Diana Holt left without making eye contact with anyone. Celeste turned to go. "Miss Monroe." Wei Jianming's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He looked at her from across the length of the mahogany table in the specific, considered way he'd been looking at her since she'd first spoken his language back to him, truly and completely. The afternoon light through the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted in the last hour, going from white to gold, and it moved across the room in a long, slow diagonal. "Stay," he said, simply. The boardroom with 3 people in it was a different room than the one that had held 14. Quieter, more honest somehow. The way rooms get when you clear them of performance. Wei Jianming sat at the head of the table. Gerald Ashford sat across from Celeste, who had finally, after 4 hours of standing on marble floors, taken a chair. Wei Jianming spoke in Mandarin, and Celeste translated for Gerald, and something in the rhythm of it, the easy back and forth, the absence of smoothed-over edges, felt like what the last 3 days of negotiations should always have been. The deal would go forward. The terms would be corrected to reflect the actual English language of the contract. Collaborative oversight, shared decision-making authority, board representation for both parties. His transition team would remain in Chicago for the week to finalize. His attorneys would review the corrected interpretation of every prior exchange. And then he said, "I have one condition. It is not negotiable." He looked at Celeste. She is the liaison. Gerald didn't hesitate. Didn't reach for language. Just nodded once. The way you nod when someone says something you already knew was coming. all communication between my team and Whitmore's during the transition, Wei Jianming continued, goes through Ms. Monroe, her language, her judgment. I will not accept substitution. Then he said something that Celeste did not immediately translate for Gerald. She held it for a moment, not because she was struggling with the words, but because some things need a second of stillness before they get handed over. Wobashiran Janjuwu, Wobashiran Toshan Washiran Jintian, Tashi Wei Gedui Washua Zhenghua Darin. She translated it for Gerald. He says he doesn't trust buildings, he doesn't trust titles, he trusts people. And today, she was the only person in this room who spoke to him without a mask. Gerald Ashford extended his hand across the table, not as a supervisor extending courtesy to a subordinate, not as a favor, as one professional acknowledging another. Across a table they both had equal right to sit at. Celeste shook it, the glass bead bracelet on her wrist, jade green, cheap glass, the one her grandmother Odessa had pressed into her hands the last Christmas they had together with the words, "It's not jade, baby, but it's yours." Caught the afternoon light and held it for a moment. The hallway outside the boardroom had gathered. Word moves fast in hotels, especially in hotels where everyone has been listening for it. There were 30 people in that corridor, delegation members, Whitmore executives, front desk staff who had no business being on this floor but had found reasons to be, bellhops, members of the catering team, a server from the restaurant on 40 who'd heard something in the service elevator and hadn't been able to stop herself. Gerald Ashford pushed the boardroom doors open and stepped into the hallway first. He was a man who chose his words with precision in professional settings, and he chose them now. I want this stated clearly and on record, he said, to the full hallway, to every face turned toward him. The deal you've all been holding your breath about for 3 days was saved this afternoon by Celeste Monroe. She is a Whitmore employee. She works on floors 12 through 15. She speaks 4 languages, which this organization discovered today instead of 11 years ago. That is a systems failure, and it belongs to the institution, not to her. Silence. Wei Jianming stepped out behind him. He moved to stand directly in front of Celeste, in full view of the hallway, and he bowed his head. Small, deliberate, precise. In his professional culture, it was not a small gesture. It was the kind that carries the weight of rooms and years. He then spoke in Mandarin, and Celeste, for the first time in her life, translated her own introduction. Her voice didn't shake. The hallway was completely still. David Chen, the young delegation member who had been on the phone in the lobby when Celeste answered his colleague's question about the restrooms, the one who had dialed Wei Jianming immediately after, who had made the call that changed the entire afternoon, stepped forward. He extended his hand. He held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. I knew, he said. The second you answered in the lobby, I knew. Philip Okafor emerged from the boardroom last. He'd been watching everything from just inside the door. He moved through the crowd, reached into his jacket, and placed his card in Celeste's hand. He was a man of 30 years in multinational business development, and not a great deal of unnecessary speech. Monday, he said. Call me. At the back of the crowd, barely visible, Raymond Tillman from the guest services department stood with his head bowed and his hands at his sides. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He just stood there and let what was on his face be exactly what it was. And at the far end of the corridor, behind the front desk she'd stood behind for 26 years, Jo Watts watched it all with both hands gripping the counter's edge and tears running steadily down her face. She didn't wipe them. She didn't look away. 26 years of quiet, competent, nearly invisible work. And this single moment, the moment she had made possible, made every one of those years feel like they'd been pointing here all along. 2 weeks later, Diana Holt was no longer the director of guest experience at the Aldrich Grand Hotel. There was no dramatic scene, no confrontation in the hallway, no public accounting. That's not how these things go in real life. Real justice is usually quieter and more structural than anyone fantasizes about. Diana Holt was transferred to an administrative role at a satellite property, a smaller building in the suburbs with fluorescent lighting, no marble floors, no crystal glasses, no high-value clients. The official documentation cited conduct detrimental to workplace culture and obstruction of operational processes. Everyone at the Aldrich who needed to understand what that meant understood. The detail that stayed with people, during Diana Holt's final 2 weeks at the main property, the only route from her office to the parking garage ran past a door on the 3rd floor, a door that now had a brass nameplate on it, mounted at exactly eye level. Celeste Monroe, Cultural and Linguistic Liaison. Every morning, every evening, impossible to avoid. On her last day, Diana Holt was carrying a box down that corridor when Celeste came from the opposite direction. They met in the middle of an empty hallway with no audience, no witnesses, no performance available to either of them. 3 seconds of silence. Celeste spoke first. Her voice held no victory and no bitterness, because she had decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to spend her energy on either of those things. "I hope things go well for you, Miss Holt." Diana Holt adjusted the box in her arms, walked away. Her heels clicked against the marble, sharp, fast, then softer, then gone. That was the last time they saw each other. Joe Watts was named Director of Guest Experience 3 weeks after that. Same office, same desk, same view of the Chicago skyline through the same window. After 26 years of being the most competent person in the building while occupying its most invisible positions, someone had finally looked at Joe Watts and said, "You've been running this place anyway. Let's make it official." At her announcement, she stood in front of the assembled staff and said one sentence: "I didn't discover Celeste Monroe. I was just the first person who didn't look away." Some people in the room understood that sentence as a professional philosophy. Some understood it as a rebuke. Joe Watts intended it as both, and Celeste Monroe, 6 months after the boardroom. She completed a professional certification in international business mediation. Full tuition funded by the Whitmore Group, every cent. Philip Okafor connected her to a network of multinational firms, 3 of which offered her positions with titles and salaries that would have seemed like fiction to the woman who'd been polishing brass fixtures in the lobby 11 months ago. She turned all 3 down, not because they weren't real, because she was done sitting at tables other people built. She incorporated Loretta Davis Cultural Consulting, named for her grandmother, who had mopped floors in office buildings for 30 years and never stopped teaching her granddaughter that language was armor. The company logo was a simple bracelet, jade green, cheap glass but yours. In her first year, she took on 4 corporate clients. In her second, 12. By year 3, she had a staff of 9 and was being flown to Seoul, Sao Paulo, and Dubai to do work that a decade earlier, nobody in the building she cleaned had thought to ask if she was capable of. She used a portion of the company's first profits to fund something that had nothing to do with revenue and everything to do with memory: a free language learning program. At the Harold Washington Library on State Street, in the same section where she'd taught herself Mandarin at 23 with library books, a cracked phone screen, and an absolute refusal to stop. She named it the Odessa Program, and she structured it specifically for working adults, people who learned in the margins of their days, between shifts and after kids were asleep, and on buses and in break rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and reheated food from home. People who didn't have tuition, didn't have time, didn't have anyone who had ever handed them a reason to believe this was possible. People like who she used to be. In the first year, 17 people completed the program's foundational Mandarin course. 3 of them were hotel housekeeping staff. One was a night shift security guard who had been teaching himself Japanese in the lobby during slow hours from a borrowed textbook he'd found at a church sale. Celeste hired him as the program's first cohort leader before the year was out. She attended every graduation ceremony the program held. She sat in the back, not the front. She did not give speeches about her own story, because the Odessa program was not about her story. It was about the 17 and the next 17 and the 17 after that. Every person sitting in a library under fluorescent lights at 9 o'clock on a weeknight, building something enormous in a world that hadn't asked for it yet. People like who she still was. On the wall of her new office, Celeste hung 3 things. The rejection letter from 14 months ago framed. This position requires a background in professional communications. Below it, a page from her old composition notebook. 3 words with a single line struck through them. Maybe she's right. And beside both, the brass nameplate that had been on her door in its first incarnation, before the bigger office, before everything. Celeste Monroe, Cultural and Linguistic Liaison. The rejection, the doubt she'd almost believed, and the proof that both were wrong. She hadn't framed the rejection out of bitterness. She'd framed it because her grandmother, Odessa, taught her that the most important things deserve a good frame. And because she needed to be able to look at it on the days when the work was hard and remember what she'd already survived. She'd survived someone looking at everything she was and deciding it wasn't worth the room. She'd survived believing for exactly one elevator ride that they might have been right. She hadn't survived either of those things because anyone had rescued her. She'd survived because she had 9 years of work in a composition notebook, and a library card that still worked, and a grandmother's voice in the back of her head that never got quiet enough to ignore. Language is the one thing nobody can repossess. Not the landlord, not the boss, not anyone. It's yours. Here's what stays with me after everything. There are an estimated 43 million multilingual adults in this country. 43 million. Most of them move through their days in jobs and roles that never once ask what they carry, what they built quietly, in the margins of their lives, without applause or encouragement or anyone paying attention. The average cost of a single failed international negotiation due to cultural miscommunication is $12.5 million. The cost of asking the person already in the room what they know, nothing. Zero. Just the willingness to look and the humility to recognize that capability doesn't organize itself neatly according to job title. What Celeste Monroe needed was never extraordinary resources or exceptional luck. She needed one person to stop and ask. Joe Watts did that. Gerald Ashford did that. David Chen did that. In a lobby, after 4 seconds of Mandarin directions changed the entire course of the afternoon. And because they did, everything else followed. The chain of it matters. Joe Watts, who had been at that hotel for 26 years and had spent every one of those years paying the kind of attention that power tends to reserve for itself, noticing people, learning names, keeping the kind of quiet watch that is actually a form of continuous advocacy. She was the first link. Without her, Gerald Ashford never has that conversation. Without that conversation, the boardroom doesn't have its outcome. One person choosing to look made everything else possible. Tomorrow, you're going to walk past someone invisible. Not a metaphorically invisible someone, a literally, practically, daily invisible person. A woman wiping down a glass table in a lobby. A man restocking a supply cart in a service corridor. Someone whose name you have never once thought to read off the tag on their chest. You will not know without asking what they speak, what they've built, what they carry that the uniform gives you no information about. The gap between what people are and what they're allowed to be in the spaces they occupy, that gap is not a talent problem. It never was. It's an attention problem, a habit of looking at the role instead of the person inside it. The room didn't give Celeste Monroe her abilities. It finally belatedly got out of the way of them. So here's what Celeste Monroe left behind. Besides a company and a certification, and a program at a public library and a brass nameplate that someone had to walk past every day for 2 weeks. She left behind evidence that the work you do in silence counts, that what you build when nobody is watching is real, that the years you spend becoming something, in a break room, on a bus, in a library under fluorescent lights, in the margins of every life that doesn't look like it has margins. Those years do not disappear just because the room hasn't noticed them yet. The room will notice, or it won't, and you build your own room. Either way, you do not stop. You do not, for one elevator ride, or one rejection letter, or one person's contempt, confuse being unseen with being small. Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And somewhere in the Harold Washington Library on State Street, in a program named for a woman who cleaned offices for 30 years and raised a child to believe that words were armor, someone right now is learning their first word in a language the world hasn't asked them to know yet. Building something enormous, in total silence, that the room will one day have no choice but to see.